Hi everyone, I'm Ian, I'm one of the coaches at Tony Smith Run Coaching, and today I'm just going to talk really quickly about the energy systems in our body and how they relate to the paces that we ask you to operate at, particularly around about the threshold pace and why it's important for training. So in very simplistic terms, we need energy to move, and that energy in our muscles is derived from a compound called ATP. Now, some ATP existing in our muscles at all times. That's what helps us jump out the way if something happens, or if we need to dart off really quickly or run up a flight of stairs. And it's great, it's instant energy in our muscles if it's there. The downside of that is there's only a very small amount of it. So perhaps only somewhere between 3 to 6 seconds, depending on the type of athlete that you are. So even in a 100-meter race, those athletes aren't just using that ATP. They're having to switch to another energy system to make it because there's not enough to sustain them. Now we need to make more ATP. We can't obviously survive on the 6 seconds which are there. There's two systems which manufacture ATP that our body can use. And those are the anaerobic system, which kicks in after your ATP has been used. Now your anaerobic system makes ATP from the glucose in your body. And again, that's fantastic. You've got plenty of glucose in your body and blood. It's making that ATP and producing it into your muscles, and it can burn it very quickly. On the downside, a byproduct of that is something called lactic acid, which then builds up in the muscle and causes fatigue. And that causes that heavy feeling that you'll feel in your muscles towards the end of a race or as you get fatigued. So finally, there's your aerobic system, where it's making that ATP by using oxygen. And the byproduct of that, carbon dioxide. So we breathe it out. No lactic acid involved there. So it's excellent. And when we're in a marathon training or half marathon training or 5K or 3K training, these are all aerobic runs. Now, it's not as simple as one energy system starts and another energy system stops. All these systems operate in concert. And when we're trying to train for distances which are aerobic, we're concentrating on making us as efficient as we possibly can at using an aerobic system and trying to move the point at which our anaerobic system starts to become dominant further to the right in terms of pace. So let's look at threshold points and training zones. This graph tries to represent how effort and pace relate. The blue line representing as you go quicker, the effort you're putting in or perceiving that you're putting in is getting harder. And you can see that as we start runs on the left-hand side of the graph, we do get a feeling of effort increasing gradually, but suddenly, and I'm sure we've all felt this, we get to the point where just even grabbing those extra few seconds seems to take 10 times the amount of effort it did to get the previous 10 seconds in pace. Now there's a reason why that happens. There's 2 points in the graph where your different energy systems start to dominate. The first point is a point called LT1. That's the point where you can start to feel fatigue just slightly creep in. You're in your aerobic zone, but you'll start to feel that general gradual onset of fatigue as you run further. Now that might be after 60 minutes, it might be after 90 minutes. But during that time, you're still able to accelerate whilst not feeling too fatigued at that point. It's at LT2 or lactate threshold 2 that things suddenly start to get hard. It's at that point that the balance of energy you're using within your system has moved from your aerobic system to your anaerobic system. And as it moves to that anaerobic system, you've started to build up that lactate in the muscles at a faster rate than your muscles can actually cope with it. And that then starts to lead to that feeling of fatigue, that feeling of heaviness, and that feeling that it just takes so much more effort just to go 1 or 2 seconds faster per kilometre. So when we talk about our training zones, anything below lactate threshold 1 is a recovery zone. We could run at this pace all day pretty much. It's not taking as much effort. The purpose of the recovery zone is to get blood flowing inside in your muscles through the capillaries, help promote recovery, normally after a long run or a heavy training session. It's helping adaptation in the zones. We then move into the aerobic zone, and that's between that lactate threshold 1 and lactate threshold 2. This is a wide zone, and we'll run our easy runs in this zone, but we'll also be running our marathon pace runs in this zone and our half marathon pace runs in this zone, anything up to the threshold pace. Once we've moved into beyond lactate threshold point 2, we're then into that anaerobic zone. We're into that zone where things are getting hard for us and we need to work harder to try to flush the lactate out of our system. So the box that we put on the screen there just represents some of those pace zones we were working at and where we pay particular attention when we're training. In your training, you'll be asked to run at pace such as half marathon pace or marathon pace or threshold. And threshold pace here is represented by the dotted line. When we're training at threshold, we want you to be sitting on that line, because by sitting on that line, you're helping your body adapt to being at that pace, helping it adapt to the shifting balance of the aerobic and anaerobic zone. And like anything, if we're spending time in that zone, we're training our body to adapt. And what we're trying to do is make it easier and more comfortable for you to run at that pace and sustain that pace for longer. If we go above that pace, we're getting some of the same effect, but not quite as good as we get it if we hit that pace right on or within that pace range. So from these labels, you can see how the paces we ask you to run at sit within this graph. So recovery pace is right down at the left-hand side. You could run all day. At easy pace, that's a wide pace zone. You may be given 45 seconds in that pace zone range because it is such a wide group. It's really you're feeling comfortable. You could run at this pace for 60, 90 minutes quite comfortably and not feel fatigued at the end of it. We then start to move a bit closer to that threshold pace with marathon pace, and then the gap gets narrower as we move to the difference between half marathon pace and threshold. Ideally in a half marathon, we want you to be running perhaps 5 or 6 seconds slower than your threshold pace that you can achieve, so you can sustain that for the full 90 minutes to 2 hours that you're on a half marathon. As we go beyond that, we dip more into the anaerobic zone for 10k pace. You could sustain more of that pace for longer because the balance of aerobic is still there. As we go further up, 5k pace, more anaerobic, less aerobic. You're going to feel that lactic build up in your muscles by the time you finish a really hard 5k. And at the top end, we've got our repetition pace of 400 meters. Those are heavily anaerobic and designed to really test our ability to deal with the lactic acid in our body and help train our bodies to deal with that build-up of acid and what we can do. What we're trying to achieve is, as we can see here, we're trying to move that LT2, that red cross on the dotted line, by training in those pace zones, by training at threshold, by training at half marathon pace, 10k pace and 5k pace in different zones. We're encouraging adaptation in our body to move that lactate threshold point further to the right and down so that we can run longer with less effort and at a faster pace. So it might look easy on paper, but we all know it's hard, particularly when we start running, to understand the differences between all these pace zones. We're used to running when we begin and thinking about running more structurally as I run quickly or I run slowly. And we're asking you to start thinking about some nuances within that will help your training. It takes time to understand that, and it's often not until we start doing some workouts that combine a threshold pace in the same workout with a sub-threshold pace that you start to learn the differences for you and how you respond. So a workout like a monofartlek, Bondarenko and Moose fartlek, for example, where we're asking you to work at different paces. Now, operating at threshold pace in those zones is great. It's lots of fun. We go fast, but it does carry with it some load on the body. So we need to limit the load on the body. Also, if you're running a marathon, you're not running at threshold, or a half marathon. You're not running at threshold. So we don't have to spend a great deal of time there to get the adaptations we're looking for. In that half marathon, and even the 10k and 5k, which are predominantly aerobic races, you're spending a long time in that aerobic zone, using that aerobic engine. So it's really important we spend lots and lots and lots of time in there. We spend lots of time in those easy zones because they do allow us to build that engine, to allow us to become more efficient at turning oxygen into energy to keep us moving, without placing a lot of undue stress and load on the body. So hopefully that's given you an idea of why we ask you to train in these different zones. Everyone has their own zones and everyone is different. But if you have any questions or you'd like to know more, then please ask your coach or reach out to me and we'll be happy to help. Thanks everyone.